this combination of globalization and rapid technological change that's accelerating, and it has disrupted economies and disrupted cultures at a pace that's probably the fastest in human history. And the transition from the agricultural era to the industrial age was pretty tumultuous. It was a big transition, but it took place over the course of 100 to 150 years. We're going through similar kinds of changes in the span of 20, or maybe shorter, when you start thinking about what's going to be happening with artificial intelligence, and driverless cars, and you name it. So you have that, and then you have this technological revolution around information. And if you look at, somebody had an interesting observation, every time there's been a revolutionary new information technology, whether it was the printing presses or radio or television, it takes a while to absorb that into a culture, and people react to it because it's powerful. It's a powerful way of transmitting stories and narratives. And right now we're seeing a collision of cultures that we're not accustomed to. It used to be that if you weren't, if you were very conservative, Muslim or Christian or Jew or Hindu, you could live in your community and people didn't question your assumptions. Now, over the internet, you're seeing your kid watch, I don't know, Lil Uzi rapping. That's a rapper, by the way. If you had a 16-year-old, you would know who Lil Uzi was. And the lyrics are astonishing, and there's just a whole bunch of stuff going on there, and you're thinking, what is the world coming to? And so the combination of economic disruption, cultural disruption, nothing feels solid to people. That's a recipe for people wanting to find security somewhere. And sadly, there is something, I think, in all of us that looks for simple answers when we're agitated and insecure. And far too often what we look for is some way of reasserting our superiority over somebody else. So we resort to tribes or sectarianism or nationalism. Whatever ism makes us feel like we're more important, we have a better grasp of what's true than that person who's not like us. And that, I think, is a lot of what you're seeing around the world. The good news is that, you know, right now we have competing narratives. The narrative that America at its best has stood for, the narrative of pluralism and tolerance and democracy and rule of law and human rights and freedom of the press and freedom of religion. That narrative, I think, is actually a more powerful narrative. And the majority of people around the world aspire to that narrative, which is the reason why people still want to come here. But we have to fight for it. It doesn't happen automatically. And so when people think about our own institutions and our own culture and our own politics, the one thing that I always want to emphasize to people is not to take for granted the institutions and norms and values that we've built. Because it's not so much that they're fragile, but they are reversible. I'll leave it at that. That was a long answer. We should go back to the lightning round.
Do you think that when you think about some of these institutions that perhaps some do take for granted, maybe not, because these institutions today that are the pillars of the American system in every way are being challenged very vocally, very loudly, even though they are still revered around the world. Some would say inside of our own country, they are being second-guessed.
Yeah.
do you think that those institutions have a real risk today of going away? Is there a real threat to these core values? And what do you do about it today? What concrete thing, instead of, we all are talking so much about what we're saying, what is to be done?
Well, look, it's important not to over-romanticize things. So when I talk about the values, ideals, institutions that I revere, that the things that make me most proud to be an American, it's important to understand that those have always been contested. And there's always been competing narratives in our country, just like there are around the world. It wasn't that long ago that you and I would not be sitting here in front of the economic club.
But that's actually the point. Your life, in many ways, romanticizes all of this.
Well, but the point is that the progress that we make in strengthening these institutions is real, but episodically, at junctures in our history, whether because we're afraid or because of external threats or what have you, they start teetering a little bit. Look, FDR is one of my political heroes. In my mind, second greatest president after Lincoln. I'm an Illinois guy. But he interned a bunch of loyal Japanese Americans during World War II. That was a threat to our institutions. There have been periods in our history where censorship was considered okay. We had the McCarthy era. We had a president who had to resign prior to impeachment because he was undermining rule of law. At every juncture, we've had to wrestle with big problems, dating back to the Constitution, a founding document that was revolutionary and declared all men were created equal. The Declaration of Independence, the charter documents, but also contained the 3/5 clause. So we've always had some contradictions. That's part of human life. The question then is, at any given time, what are we doing to defend our best selves and and those timeless values that should transcend party? So I would argue, for example, that freedom of the press is such an ideal. During my presidency, the press often drove me nuts. It wasn't just the conservative press that drove me nuts. Sometimes the liberal, quote-unquote, press drove me nuts. There were times where I thought reporters were ill-informed. There were times where they didn't actually get the story right. But what I understood was that principle of the free press was vital. And that as president, part of my job was to make sure that that was maintained. And so, we don't have time to go into detail about everything people should do. But I wouldn't underestimate the very simple act of being engaged, paying attention, and speaking out. I mean, typically that's what it comes down to in a democracy. And I do think because we've been so wealthy and so successful that we get complacent and assume that things continue the way they have been, just automatically, and they don't. You have to tend to this garden of democracy, otherwise things can fall apart fairly quickly. And we've seen societies where that happens, right? Now, presumably there was a ballroom here in Vienna in the late 1920s or 30s that looked pretty sophisticated and seemed as if, with the music and the art and the literature and the science that was emerging, it would continue into perpetuity. And then 60 million people died. And an entire world was plunged into chaos. So, you gotta pay attention and vote.